Hi everyone, my name is Shahreen and I'm a PhD student at York University's Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Today I would like to share with you my paper which focuses on the potential and utility of participatory geographic information systems, PGIS, and Indigenous natural resource management. My paper is titled Tech for Collaboration, How PGIS Can Mobilize Indigenous Natural Resource Management. I'm mainly speaking to the integration of Indigenous knowledge within PGIS platforms. I'll be speaking to the benefits of PGIS platforms for Indigenous natural resource management and agency, but we'll also discuss the ethical considerations and challenges for integrating Indigenous knowledge into these platforms. Although this topic is not directly related to my dissertation research as a PhD student, it is motivated by my interest and appreciation for Indigenous practices and beliefs, which have come up in my work at Health Canada, where I focus on public health and environmental work. And an understanding of Indigenous practices is also relevant to my dissertation research, which on the other hand centers around city planning and urban Indigenous communities in Canadian cities. I became acquainted with PGIS platforms within my role as a teaching assistant for the York University course, Introduction to Environmental Documentaries, where I had the opportunity to work with Professor Mark Terry, who pioneered the GeoDoc PGIS platform. His work has sparked my curiosity and motivated me to explore the potential of PGIS systems in mobilizing Indigenous natural resource management. Going forward, this research paper seeks to address the following questions. Question 1, how can Indigenous knowledge be applied towards natural resource management frameworks and environmental assessments? Question 2, how can Indigenous knowledge be stored and mobilized within PGIS platforms for future generations? Question 3, what are the challenges and limitations surrounding the implementation of Indigenous knowledge within PGIS platforms in natural resource management? And question 4, what are the ethics surrounding such platforms? Through answering these questions, this paper aims to contribute to the growing body of literature that examines the potential of PGIS as a tool for local communities to have more agency within natural resource management, particularly contributing to the limited literature focusing on how Indigenous communities in Canada can use GIS platforms to have more voice and agency in natural resource management processes. Methodology. This research paper employs a literature review methodology, which involves a comprehensive examination of case studies of participatory GIS platforms that have been used and implemented by Indigenous communities in Canada and various other countries. These case studies serve as valuable resources for understanding the effective application of Indigenous knowledge in natural resource management across diverse environments. In addition to the case studies in Canada and the US, the research paper also examines the experiences of Indigenous communities in countries including Burkina Faso, Timor-Leste, Cameroon, and Suriname. The wealth of information obtained from these case studies provides valuable insights into the best practices and lessons learned by researcher practitioners who have worked in these settings. These insights are critical in informing the implementation of PGIS platforms by Indigenous communities in Canada. Moreover, the literature review extends to countries outside Canada to supplement the limited literature on Indigenous communities in Canada using PGIS platforms. The aim of this research is to develop a more comprehensive understanding of PGIS implementation for Indigenous natural resource management through the use of Indigenous knowledge and to identify relevant best practices that can be adapted to Indigenous communities in Canada. Overall, this research paper utilizes a literature review methodology to provide a comprehensive analysis of the use of PGIS platforms by Indigenous communities. The paper identifies factors that contribute to successful PGIS implementation, as well as challenges, and presents insights and best practices that can inform future PGIS projects with Indigenous communities in Canada and abroad. Moving on to my argument, this paper is rather exploratory in nature, as there is limited literature available on the use of Indigenous knowledge in natural resource management, particularly with using PGIS. Nevertheless, there are increasing examples worldwide of Indigenous knowledge being applied to natural resource management, indicating the benefits of incorporating this knowledge framework into resource management practices. In Burkina Faso, traditional ecological knowledge by Indigenous communities is being used to manage water resources during periods of drought. By relying on their traditional knowledge of the environment and the behavior of animals, the communities were able to identify and protect critical water sources during dry periods, ensuring their continued access to water. In Timor-Leste, traditional land management practices have been used to protect biodiversity and natural resources. Local communities use their knowledge of forest ecosystems to maintain and preserve habitats for endangered species, while also sustainably harvesting forest products for their own use. In the United States, the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in Massachusetts has implemented a community-based shellfish management program, which incorporates traditional ecological knowledge into modern management practices. The program involves community members monitoring shellfish populations, ensuring sustainable harvest practices, and restoring damaged habitats. Finally, in Canada, Indigenous knowledge has been used by Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. First Nations communities, for example, have used Indigenous knowledge to manage forests, fisheries, and other natural resources for centuries. Examples include the Cree Nation of Mistissini, located in Quebec, who have been using PGIS to support natural resource management and community planning efforts. This includes the development of a community-based forest management plan, which includes the creation of a forest inventory, mapping of ecological features, and identification of traditional land uses. In addition to natural resource management, PGIS use have also been used by the Cree Nation of Mistissini for community planning purposes. For example, the community has used PGIS to map traditional land use and occupancy, and to map cultural sites and resources, which has helped to preserve and protect their cultural heritage. However, my paper also recognizes that Western research practices have historically been unethical towards Indigenous communities in Canada and abroad. In light of this, my argument emphasizes the importance of being especially conscientious when utilizing Indigenous knowledge in PGIS applications. Such applications must strive for the ethical use of PGIS to avoid causing any further harm to Indigenous communities in Canada. This involves working collaboratively with Indigenous communities to co-create platforms that respect and incorporate their belief systems, while avoiding any misuse of Indigenous knowledge and working to prevent further harm to Indigenous communities in Canada. This paper further contributes to an understanding that Indigenous knowledge is proprietary knowledge that belongs to Indigenous communities, and the decision to share it is entirely their own. While this knowledge is valuable, it must not be misused or exploited, as has unfortunately happened in the past and continues to happen presently. Examples of this include biopiracy, wherein Indigenous knowledge of plants has been used by pharmaceutical companies to patent medicinal plants and traditional remedies without the consent of the Indigenous communities that developed them. As such, it is critical to respect the rights and choices of Indigenous communities when incorporating their knowledge into PGIS platforms. In summary, my argument in this paper is that the use of Indigenous knowledge in PGIS platforms has immense potential to benefit natural resource management practices. However, this must be done with the utmost respect for the ethical and proprietary considerations of Indigenous communities. By co-creating PGIS platforms with Indigenous communities and ensuring the ethical use of Indigenous knowledge, we can move towards more sustainable and equitable natural resource management practices. The findings of my paper indicate that Indigenous knowledge can be integrated within PGIS platforms. In fact, it is already being done. However, it is crucial to acknowledge that Indigenous knowledge generally should not be fragmented into qualitative versus quantitative data. Instead, Indigenous knowledge must be accepted as a complete knowledge system that encompasses Indigenous spiritualities, experiential knowledge, cultural practices, traditional beliefs, and more. As such, Indigenous knowledge should not be reduced into quantifiable data to suit Western science-based GIS applications, as this would not respect Indigenous knowledge's integrity as a whole holistic system. It is essential that PGIS platforms that incorporate Indigenous knowledge are co-created with Indigenous communities, and that these communities have ownership and full control for what is developed. Furthermore, my paper highlights that PGIS is not a panacea solution that can solely empower Indigenous people without additional measures. While incorporating Indigenous knowledge into PGIS platforms can lead to improved dialogue, countermapping, and a more equitable distribution of power and resources, there are many challenges in implementing PGIS platforms. This includes the significant technical and financial resources required to develop mutually beneficial platforms. Within the ethics of creating Indigenous knowledge-based PGIS platforms, GIS practitioners and researchers must democratize spatial knowledge production strategies. They should also be aware that Indigenous knowledge does not always align with Western scientific methods and should be cognizant of challenges in data synthesis and analysis when translating Indigenous knowledge into data that can be integrated into decision-making processes within natural resource management without compromising the integrity of this knowledge system. Essentially, PGIS practitioners who work to integrate Indigenous knowledge within PGIS platforms are working to bridge the gap between Indigenous knowledge and Western knowledge, presenting an additional technical barrier, and also pointing to a larger issue of how academic research tends to value Western knowledge systems over others. As indicated, my paper demonstrated that PGIS platforms are not sufficient to sustain change, and it is vital to facilitate dialogue and collaboration between Indigenous communities and other natural resource partners. Case studies referenced within this paper show that Indigenous communities tend to have emotional attachments to specific places, and this is a core part of their stewardship practices. Their evaluation of sacred sites and land that provide them with food, medicine, or materials for traditional practices is linked to the idea that these components are essential to Indigenous ways of life. Therefore, it is important to recognize the significance of effective geography to Indigenous people when incorporating Indigenous knowledge into PGIS platforms. Altogether, this can promote a better understanding of Indigenous knowledge and empower Indigenous communities in decision-making processes concerning natural resource management. In conclusion, this research sheds light on the importance of Indigenous knowledge and its potential to envision more equitable and sustainable approaches within natural resource management. By emphasizing the sustainable use and responsible stewardship of natural resources, Indigenous knowledge can contribute significantly to natural resource management frameworks. While PGIS platforms alone are not a solution, they can promote a more respectful and careful integration of Indigenous knowledge by using participatory and collaborative methodologies and working directly with Indigenous communities. However, ethical considerations surrounding the ownership and sharing of Indigenous knowledge must be considered, and challenges in implementing these platforms must be addressed through ongoing work in this research area to mainstream technical approaches that support the integration of Indigenous knowledge into PGIS and also teach practitioners to tread respectfully. Ultimately, it is within our best course of action to see Indigenous knowledge as a vital tool for natural resource management for the benefit of present and future generations. If you are interested in seeing my references and exploring further research in this area, this slide and the next show my references. And this slide as well, showing further references. Most of these resources have links attached. I would like to express my gratitude to everyone for listening to this presentation on my research. I appreciate your time and attention and sincerely hope you found this presentation informative and engaging. If you have any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to hear from you. Thank you.